My grandfather's town was always a quiet and peaceful place. It's the kind of place that seems frozen in time, where the old bricks of the houses are the same ones placed decades ago, and the cobblestone streets tell stories that no one dares to remember. It's a small town in central Mexico, a place that, if not for the visits we made from time to time, would have been forgotten by our family. For as long as I can remember, visits to my grandfather's town always had a different atmosphere. My grandfather was a reserved but charismatic man. He always greeted the few who approached him with a smile, although he never shared much about his life. We knew he had been in the military in his youth, but the details of his career always remained a mystery. Sometimes, when I was a child, I would sit with him on the old wooden rocking chair he had on the porch and ask him questions about his days in the army. But he would always respond evasively or simply change the subject. The town itself, as I mentioned, was peaceful. The shops closed early, and the nights were so quiet that any sound, no matter how small, seemed to echo in the air. Often I would wake up in the early morning to the distant sound of dogs barking or the creaking of the tree branches swaying in the breeze. It never bothered me. In fact, I found comfort in the idea that I was in such a peaceful place. But as I would later learn, that calm was only a facade, a mask that hid something much darker. A few years ago, my grandfather passed away. He was over 90 years old when he died, and his death wasn't a surprise, but it did leave a void in our family. After his death, my parents decided it would be best to sell the old house in the town since none of us had plans to live there. I volunteered to go and collect the few belongings that were left and oversee the selling process. It was the perfect excuse to say goodbye to the place that, despite everything, I had always felt was a refuge during my childhood. I arrived in the town on a sunny afternoon. Everything looked exactly the same as in my memories. The dry air, the dust rising with the wind, and the few residents who recognized me greeted me with a slight nod. My grandfather's house was still standing, though the years and neglect had left it a bit more worn down. When I entered, a strange feeling came over me. The familiar smell of old wood and earth immediately transported me back to my childhood. But this time, something was different. Something I hadn't noticed before. I spent the first few days cleaning, packing, and organizing everything my grandfather had left behind. There wasn't much, but each object had its own story. It was during those days that a neighbor, a woman who had lived in the town her whole life, came to the house. I had never spoken much with her, but her presence had always felt familiar. She greeted me with a sad smile, and we began to talk about my grandfather, about how well-liked he had been in the town. He was always a respected man, she said, as she looked at the house with nostalgia. But I don't know if everyone knew him as well as they thought. Her comment puzzled me. I knew my grandfather had lived a life before becoming the quiet and reserved man I knew, but I had never thought there was more that we didn't know. The neighbor seemed to notice my discomfort, and after a long silence, she sighed and lowered her gaze. "There are things from the past that are best left alone, but I think you have the right to know," she said in a serious tone that contrasted with her friendly expression. She invited me to her house, and although I hesitated at first, something in her way of speaking made me follow her. When we arrived at her living room, she sat in an old wicker chair and offered me a glass of water. "Your grandfather," she began with a pause that seemed to last an eternity, "was not just a retired soldier. He was something more, something that few in town want to remember." She told me that years ago the town had been the center of a clandestine operation, a network that used the most secluded houses for something I could never have imagined: secret childbirths. Women came from faraway places, desperate, sometimes deceived, and gave birth in secret. But the worst part wasn't that the births took place in deplorable conditions and outside the reach of the law. The truly disturbing part was what happened afterward. The babies were sold to wealthy families in nearby cities. The neighbor looked me in the eyes as she recounted all of this, and I felt a lump in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could such a peaceful place have harbored something so macabre? "Your grandfather," she continued, "wasn't just aware of it all. He was one of the ones who ran it. He wasn't a mere spectator. He was the trusted man of those who managed the business." My hands began to sweat. Everything I thought I knew about my grandfather, about his life, was falling apart before me. The neighbor explained that for years the babies born in those houses were delivered to families who paid large sums of money for them. It was a lucrative business and no one in the town said anything. Those who knew remained silent out of fear or because, in some way, They too benefited from it. Everything ran smoothly until one of the mothers, a young woman who had been deceived into giving up her baby, returned to the town. She had been searching for her child for months, and when she finally located the place where she had given birth, she begged for the baby's return. She was willing to return the money she had been paid. At first, they tried to dissuade her, but her persistence triggered something no one expected: an investigation. According to the neighbor, when the authorities began asking questions, many in the town panicked. Those involved did everything they could to cover up what had happened. Bribes were paid, evidence was destroyed, and the most important players, like my grandfather, managed to divert the investigators' attention. However, the business didn't stop completely. It simply moved to another place, another town that wasn't under the scrutiny of the authorities. As the neighbor spoke, my mind raced. How had it been possible that my grandfather, the man who taught me to fish, who told me stories about his youth, had been part of something so monstrous? Everything he had told me about his life in the army, about the pride he felt in serving his country, was unraveling. He never talked about this, did he? The neighbor asked, as if reading my thoughts. I shook my head. My grandfather had never mentioned anything even remotely close to this. To me, he had always been a simple, quiet man, someone who had retired to this small town to live out the rest of his days in peace. He didn't because in his mind he was protecting you, the neighbor continued. To him, what he did was just part of his job, something he had to do to survive. And maybe in his own distorted way of seeing the world, he thought he was helping those women and those babies. I couldn't bear to listen any longer. I stood up, my heart racing. I felt as though the air in the small house was becoming dense, suffocating. I thanked the neighbor and left hastily, unsure of what to think or how to feel. Back at my grandfather's house, I sat in the living room, surrounded by the few belongings he had left behind. The clock on the wall continued to tick with its monotonous rhythm, but now everything felt different. I could no longer look at the house the same way. Everything I had loved about that place, everything that represented my childhood, had transformed into a shadow of what I once thought it was. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through some old documents and letters that my grandfather had kept in a chest in his room. I found pictures of him in his youth with other men, all in military uniforms. But among those photos, there was a letter that caught my attention. It was from someone who signed only as R. The letter talked about the business and about the deliveries that had been completed without problems. The letter was dated many years ago, probably before I was born. I felt a mix of anger and sadness as I read it. This confirmed what the neighbor had told me. My grandfather hadn't just been involved, he had been a key player in the entire operation. That night, I couldn't sleep. The neighbor's words echoed in my head, and the image of my grandfather, the man who had been my childhood hero, had transformed into something I could barely recognize. The town, which I had once seen as a peaceful refuge, now seemed to me like a dark place, full of secrets and lies. The next day I packed up what little remained and left the town. I never spoke to the neighbor again, nor to anyone else from that place. My family never knew the whole truth. I didn't have the courage to tell them what I had discovered. Maybe deep down I still wanted to protect the memory of my grandfather, even though that memory was now forever stained. When I was a kid, I grew up in a small, close-knit town. I hated it. Everyone knew you, and there was no concept of a secret. If you told one person something, you'd hear it from someone else within a maximum of 2 days. I had a group of 4 or 5 friends at most whom I truly trusted to share things with. Hell, there were some things I couldn't even tell my little sister without her using it against me. Or vice versa. We used it as leverage against each other. That's what makes this situation seem even crazier to me. Our school classes were pretty normal in terms of curriculum and size, in my opinion. Maybe there were between 10 and 15 of us in the classroom. Nobody from outside our town was interested in going to our school. And as soon as they had the chance, the high school kids who had cars would choose to attend a school outside of our district to escape, or people would move away before that. I wasn't that lucky. My family was far from rich, so we stayed in our town until I was old enough to move out. Anyway, back to the classes. Obviously, being teenagers, relationships were bound to happen. There weren't many people to choose from, and some could be a year older or younger than you. I dated several different girls, but there was one I was with for about 2 years. For privacy reasons, I'll call her Melissa. On the outside, Melissa was fun to be around. She was tall, had dark shoulder-length hair, and dark brown eyes with freckles. She could talk to anyone. She was definitely extroverted, and I never saw a bad side to her. I think she tried hard to be friends with everyone. For a long time, she was part of a group of friends. She wore makeup and dressed more femininely, but she also loved going to the river with me and some of our friends to catch things, destroy things, and maybe enjoy a few drinks. It was during the summer that I really got to know her better. I know her father was a drunk and her mother worked a lot, so she didn't see them much. She would often come to our house for dinner and sometimes even sleep over in our living room. Once she had a fight with her father. He grabbed her and started choking her until her mother finally convinced him to let her go, but her mother told her it would be best for her to leave for a while. She came to our house crying and I helped calm her down, and I think that solidified our relationship in a strange way. I was furious. My parents weren't perfect, but they never hurt us. How could a father do that to his own child? It was worse when the police came and did absolutely nothing. They went to her house, took her father away, he apologized, and he was allowed to return home once he sobered up, as if that really changed anything. She practically lived with us at times. She slept on the couch and sometimes she'd fall asleep in my room, and I'd sleep in the living room. We acted like a normal couple for the most part, hanging out with friends, walking to class together, things like that. But after a while, I began to see a different side of her. I realized that some of the most insignificant things made her angry. If a friend teased her about something, like throwing a ball in a weird way, and I didn't immediately defend her, she'd get mad. At first, she'd just ignore me for the rest of the night. Then she'd complain to me privately about how embarrassed she was. But then it started becoming more public. She would criticize me in front of our friends and even my parents, then storm off angry. This was my first serious relationship, so I didn't really know how to react. I went through the same routines. I'd apologize, we'd make up, and everything would be fine again. However, it always seemed to get worse. The more serious fights would happen when we were alone. She'd kick things, hit things, scream if she could, and sometimes even hit me. Usually she'd just punch me in the chest or slap me, but it was still unusual. I figured it had to do with her father, the way he was. Maybe she acted this way because she was used to it. So I did what I could to calm her down, but after a while, that stopped working. I had to lock myself in my room or leave until she calmed down. But of course, then the accusations would start. She began raising her voice and pushing me at school, which was already embarrassing for me, so I'd walk away. For some reason, when I did this, she thought I was trying to hide from her because of another girlfriend. She started accusing me of cheating on her and would always show up at my classroom door to see if I was leaving with another girl. We had a group project in one of my classes, and I was paired with my friend Joel and a girl I didn't know very well. As I was leaving the classroom, Melissa slapped me in the face and started saying she had finally caught me. I remember the girl just looking horrified while trying to leave without Melissa seeing her. People started gathering around, but Melissa had her eyes locked on her and then jumped on her back, starting to hit her. I managed to pull Melissa off the girl and told her we were done. I remember calling her a psycho or something equally hurtful because I saw how her expression changed to sadness, and she ran off. Of course, I got called into the office and had to explain what had happened. Melissa ended up getting expelled. I told them it was my fault, hoping the other girl wouldn't get into trouble, and then I got suspended for a term. I finished my suspension, as awkward as it was, and returned to school being the topic of everyone's discussions. I didn't hear much about what happened to Melissa, except for what my friends knew, which wasn't much until I got back. I heard her parents had to put her in therapy and possibly in some sort of school for troubled teens, but I never saw her again. That was about 18 years ago. Right after high school, I left that town. I wanted to move to a much livelier place and meet new people. My sister and I even inspired our parents to move out a few years ago. Still, I'm surprised by how many updates and gossip they share with me about the people living there. And well, this is where things get crazy. Around the time of our 10-year high school reunion, people started contacting me to get together. I thought, why not? And decided to start making plans to visit. However, a few weeks later, I received a frantic call from my mother late at night, telling me there had been a fire in our old town. She said it had been at Melissa's house, and the most terrifying part, her parents had died in the fire. My dad was good friends with one of the local cops, and he told him that Melissa still lived there occasionally, but she had been working the night it happened. They had to go pick her up. After the investigation, they determined her father had passed out with a cigarette. He was completely drunk, of course, and her mother had taken sleeping pills. It was just a bad situation, and I felt bad for her. I almost wanted to reach out to her, maybe at least offer my condolences, but something told me not to. My mother went to the funeral and said Melissa was just a shadow. She only sat in the front row, staring straight ahead until the service ended. Afterward, my mom said she didn't see her anywhere, so she left her card with the other items and left. After that, I didn't hear anything about Melissa or her life until last year. This time, my friend sent me a text with a link to the local news from our old town. It started with a suspicious fire. The police had been called to an old barn that was burning behind one of the bars. Apparently, someone came out, smelled the smoke, saw the flames through the trees separating the property, and called 911. After they put out the fire, they found the body of a man there. He had been stabbed multiple times, hit with a shovel, then doused in some type of oil and set on fire. They couldn't identify the guy because he had nothing on him. That was already pretty crazy, right? Not for that place, though. Rumors started flying quickly. People started talking, but not to the police. However, that didn't stop them from finding out. This is where my friend started filling in the gaps of the story. He still lives there. In fact, he took over his parents' truck shop, so he gets a lot of information. It turns out the guy was identified as the owner of the bar. They figured it out because his wallet was found in the bar's dumpster, but the cash was missing. Coincidentally, someone had shown up at another bar, flashing money and buying drinks for everyone, saying it was in honor of this guy. The thing is, they hadn't publicly announced the man's identity, so the police took note of this. They brought the girl in for questioning, and when she finally confessed to the murder, I'm sure you know where this is going. It was Melissa. Apparently, she had been involved with the owner, or at least there was something going on between them. However, he was married. Rumor has it the wife found out and the owner tried to break it off with Melissa, but she didn't take it well. Now that she's imprisoned for this, rumors are swirling again, suggesting she might have been involved in her parents' deaths. So not only did I date an unstable girl in high school, but she turned out to be a murderer. So I guess I got lucky back then, but it makes me think about what could have happened if I had reached out to her when her parents died. What if we hadn't moved away? Could I have been one of her victims? I also wonder if this is tied to her childhood, and if that could have made a difference. One thing I did tell my friend, though, is that he'll have to come visit me from now on because I don't want to set foot in that place again. When I was in high school, I joined a new group of friends. This was in the early 2000s. The goth and emo style was still quite popular at the time. I describe my group of friends as your typical goth and emo group. One of my friends, Marcos, and I hit it off right away. My home life wasn't the best, and Marcos really understood that. We both had sisters whom our parents loved and spoiled. We felt really neglected and ignored. Marcos was a bit strange sometimes, claiming to be a Satanist, but no one took him seriously. Another friend of mine, Daniel, was also into satanic things and immediately bonded with Marcos. The three of us became inseparable after that. We would hang out, smoke weed, and drive around bothering people. And once we even snuck into the high school after hours and vandalized lockers. It was stupid fun for delinquent teens. However, I started to feel differently about my friends after a party we went to. It was around Halloween during my senior year in high school in October 2009. Marcos had invited Daniel and some of our friends to a party one weekend when his parents were out of town. We lived in a small town where nothing really happened, but Marcos lived in a more suburban busy area, in a new subdivision, while the rest of us lived in mobile homes and ranch houses. Marcos lived in a new 2-story house. It was funny that a guy from that kind of environment claimed to be so emo. At the party, there was the usual: snacks, drinks, some weed, a few pills, and alcohol. Marcos then promised a little surprise for later. The party went as expected: loud music and the occasional argument under the influence of drugs. What happened next I will never forget. It was around 11 o'clock at night when Marcos and Daniel told everyone to gather in the basement. Marcos's dad had converted the basement into a game and lounge room, something straight out of That 70s Show. We all gathered in the seating area, and my two best friends showed us the surprise. Inside a closet there was a woman. She was tied up and gagged with a t-shirt. Instantly, we all recognized this woman as Rocio, a local homeless woman who collected cans and was known for using drugs around town. "Marcos, what the hell is going on here?" I asked, while the others sat down very confused. "Juan helped us bring her here. Marcos responded. "We're going to have some fun tonight." Daniel was smiling as he started passing out darts to the party guests. Our first event of the night, human dartboard. "Seriously, what the hell is wrong with you?" a girl in the room asked while we were all in shock. This was too much, even for Marcos. Daniel threw a dart. It landed in Rocio's arm and she let out a muffled scream through the t-shirt. "How the hell did you get her here?" I asked. Marcos said that he and Daniel had invited Rocio and Juan to smoke and drink with them. Juan was also a local homeless man. Juan had the mind of a 12-year-old, and Rocio was an addict. I wasn't surprised they accepted the offer. Apparently Juan helped tie Rocio up and stuff her in the closet. She had been there for a day and no one knew. "Who's next?" Marcos asked. "After me, of course." Marcos threw a dart and hit Rocio just below the chest. She screamed in pain again. This was sick, but others actually joined in this twisted game. By the end, Rocio had 10 darts sticking out of her body. I refused to participate. Marcos's older brother was blocking the only exit. He had been filming the entire night with his camcorder and threatened to show the video to our parents or the police if we tried to leave. We were being blackmailed at that point. "Ready for the next game?" Daniel asked. He and Marcos dragged Rocio to the floor and then sat her in the center of a poorly drawn chalk circle that Marcos had made. They then injected her with what Marcos claimed was heroin, but no one really knew. "Tonight we sacrifice an untouchable to the king, our Lord Satan," Marcos declared. "Daniel, the instruments, please," Marcos requested. Daniel had a black bag in his hand. When he opened it, we saw a variety of knives, kitchen knives, butter knives, etc. This was sick and twisted. Marcos had done questionable things before, but this was too much. A blood sacrifice to please the king. Marcos took a kitchen knife and made a small cut on Rocio. She screamed in pain. Some of the girls in the room had tears in their eyes, and I felt like my stomach was in knots. I was a little high, but even I knew this was madness. What happened next literally made me throw up. Marcos actually licked the blood off the knife, the blood of a homeless addict who had been who knows where. Then Marcos and Daniel kissed, sharing their offering. I knew Marcos was bisexual, but Daniel's behavior was completely unexpected. I really regretted introducing the two of them. Daniel had always been weird, but this was too much. Other partygoers actually took turns cutting Rocio and licking her blood. They were older guys and one girl. I had no idea who they were. The rest of us, 2 guys and 3 girls, refused to participate in this. Suddenly, someone whispered in my ear, "I'm going to call the cops, screw that video." It was a girl I knew from school. She was one of the few of us who had a cell phone and had hidden it in her purse. "Cover me, please," she told me. Rocio was still crying in horror while the Satanists were doing their thing on the other side of the room. I sat there hoping they wouldn't try to kill her. "Please don't let them kill this woman in front of me," I told myself. The girl dialed 911 and quietly reported to the police. She told them in a low voice where we were and what was happening. Then I saw a huge knife being raised above Rocio. "They're not going to kill this woman in front of me." I stood up and shouted, "Enough!" Seriously, this has gone too far. They looked at me in surprise, but as if in a trance, they turned back to Rocio. Then Marcos responded, "The blood must be offered to the king," he said in an extremely creepy and ridiculous tone. I ran toward him and tackled him to the ground. Daniel tried to stop me, but I managed to push him away. Suddenly the girls shouted that the police were on their way, and then all hell broke loose. The so-called Satanists ran for the door. Marcos's brother moved and let them out. Daniel ran to leave, abandoning Marcos alone in the basement with me and Rocio. I had to stay to protect her and make sure he didn't try anything. Marcos was completely deranged at that point. The police arrived a few minutes later. The girl and I stayed to tell them everything that had happened. Rocio was taken away in an ambulance. She survived, but after that we never saw her walking around town again. I have no idea what happened to her. Marcos and Daniel were arrested and sent to a juvenile detention center. I graduated and cut off all contact with them. I even moved away out of sheer fear that they might try to find me. Who knows what people like that could attempt? The idiot brother of Marcos kept the tape in his camcorder, and the police were able to use it to track down the others who participated in the twisted ritual, including some kids from the high school. My only advice is to really be careful with the people you choose to hang out with. You never know how crazy those who claim to be your friends might be. When I was just 15 years old, my parents moved us from the city to a small town about 50 miles from where I grew up. I had to start the 10th grade at a completely new school without any friends, and it was probably the loneliest and most stressful time of my life. I was actually a bit angry with my parents for uprooting my entire existence like that, and a new bedroom and a bigger backyard didn't mean anything to me when I had lost all my friends in familiar places. I guess that makes me sound like a total ingrate, but the place we used to live wasn't exactly a great place for teenagers. There were a lot of drugs, etc. And I understand that these days, but back then I wasn't happy. I was completely nervous during the first week of 10th grade. I had this idea in my head that I would remain friendless until graduation, at which point I would be so socially stunted that I'd be alone for life. Something very irrational, I know. And on the surface, it seemed like I had been proven wrong in a relatively short time because, around the beginning of my third week, a group of guys invited me to sit with them at lunch. I was a ball of anxiety, but they were nice and told me I was welcome to sit with them for lunch in the future. That meant a lot to me since I always felt like I was being super watched every time I walked between tables trying to find a place to sit. I sat with them for the rest of that third week, staying quiet and trying to fly under the radar. They'd ask me questions from time to time, like where I was from, what kinds of things I liked, and I always tried to give the least offensive answer possible again, just trying to fit in as best I could. But then, on Friday, they asked if I wanted to hang out that night after school. I had to contain my excitement because it meant a lot to me that they thought I was cool enough to hang out. When I asked where they usually hung out, they said, "The bridge." The bridge turned out to be an old, unused railroad bridge that crossed a river about a mile and a half outside of town. Every weekend, my new group of friends would head out there with whatever tobacco or alcohol they could get, because they were free to do whatever they wanted there. Remember I told you about growing up in a somewhat bad neighborhood? Well, I had already been into all kinds of stuff before we moved out of town. It wasn't anything too bad, but I had already tried cigarettes and stuff like that, so it wasn't like I was thinking, oh no, these are bad kids. I better stay in the after-school Bible study club or whatever. I was willing to hang out with them and was excited that they had even asked me. So at the end of the school day, my new friends came to make sure I'd be going to the bridge later that night. I said, sure, I'll be there, and then tried to hide the spring in my step as I walked away. I was legitimately euphoric. I had found a new group of friends, and they seemed to be exactly my type of people too. That's why I got so mad when a kid came to sit next to me on the bus and told me not to hang out with them. I'm probably going to sound like a complete jerk here, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but I thought the kid who approached me was a total loser. His clothes were dirty, he smelled a bit, and he had this wild red hair that obviously wasn't washed. When he told me not to hang out with those guys, I thought he was trying to, I don't know, sabotage me or something. I know that makes me sound like a jerk and a bit cynical, but I was so insecure about my status as the new kid that I couldn't conceive of anyone going out of their way to be kind to me. I told him to get lost, then turned toward the window and ignored him, but he persisted. He said something like, "I know this sounds crazy, but I think those guys are going to try to hurt you." I overheard them talking about pushing someone and wondering if the fall would kill them. I think they were talking about you. Again, I told him to get lost, only much more harshly this time, and eventually he left me alone. But after I got off the bus and walked back to my house, what he said kept playing over and over in my head. My new friends had invited me to the bridge, and they themselves had said it was a railroad bridge over a river. Had they invited me there because they really wanted to be friends, or was it a trick and they planned to push me off the bridge as a prank? I think if the kid had said they were going to beat me up or something vague like that, I wouldn't have given it a second thought. But he specifically mentioned pushing and falling. I remember thinking about how the kid who warned me could have known all about their hangout spot to give me such a specific and false warning, if that makes sense. After all, I didn't know much about the social dynamics in the town, which, in practical terms, meant I had no idea who to believe or trust. I spent about an hour thinking it over, and then when it came time to go meet my new friends at the bridge, I chickened out and decided not to go. I say chickened out because that's what it felt like at the time. I was too scared to go meet them in case it was all a setup for a prank, but I was also scared that I was ruining my one chance to fit in with a group of friends at school. I wrestled with both ideas for another 2 hours, and then when I realized it was probably too late to head out, I just fell into a mild depression. On the surface, the reaction was as bad as I feared. My new friend said I couldn't sit with them anymore because I had been rude by turning down their invitation. They said they had waited almost all night for me to show up, and that I hadn't even shown them the courtesy of coming by for 5 minutes. At that moment, I was horrified. I had convinced myself that maybe they wouldn't react so badly, but there they were, kicking me out of that friend group before I even had the chance to prove myself. I was devastated, and I went to sit alone, and to top it off, the red-haired smelly kid came and sat with me almost like he pitied me. Now I know what you're thinking. The red-haired smelly kid is a good guy, and these days I'd totally agree with you. But back then, my dumb 15-year-old self felt nothing but disdain for him. If the moral of this story is that kids can be cruel, then sadly I guess that example extends to me too, because once again, I told the kid to get lost, leave me alone, and not even think about sitting with me again. I condemned myself to being alone again for a week until, by pure chance, another new kid joined the 10th grade. I thought this was my shot at making a friend. He was a guy, and it seemed like he might be interested in things similar to mine, so my hopes were high. The next chance I got, I sat with him during lunch and started chatting with him a little. But then, at the next lunch period, guess who called him over to sit at their table? You guessed it, the old group of friends I had been a part of for a short time. I thought they had done it on purpose, and I guess on some level they had. It seemed like they had thrown me out of a friend group and now were denying me the chance to form another. It was like a nightmare scenario where the guys I thought would be my friends turned out to be my bullies. I sank even further into that typical teenage depression, watching the new kid do all the things I should have been doing with the people I should have been doing them with. And every Friday night for weeks, I would lie in my room totally depressed, wondering what those guys were doing at the bridge. Obviously, they hadn't been planning to prank me because the new kid had been hanging out with them for weeks, probably at the bridge too, and if they had played a prank on him, especially pushing him off the bridge, he was handling it very well. Again, this completely depressed me, and most of all, I was out of my mind furious with that red-haired, smelly kid. I thought he had totally tricked me into not hanging out with my future group of friends, probably just to have me for himself, which, to be fair, is exactly what I tried to do with the newer kid who joined the 10th grade after me. I remember one Friday night just being livid with that smelly kid, fantasizing about giving him a good punch in the cafeteria. But then, the next day, when I was throwing a ball around with my dad, he told me that if they had kicked me out without a second thought, those guys weren't friends in the first place, and that in the end, I'd be glad I hadn't gone to the bridge that Friday night because I wouldn't be stuck hanging out with such fickle losers. At the time, it was somewhat comforting, but neither of us had any idea how right he really was. The next morning, that is Sunday, I had been awake for maybe 2 or 3 hours when I noticed there was something strange in the air. I hadn't been in town long, but weekends were like weekends anywhere else. Lots of people had the day off, kids weren't in school, so I was used to seeing people walking down the street, either alone or with their dogs. There was also this group of 3 boys who used to ride their bikes down the street. I'd see them after school sometimes, and I always saw them on the weekends, but that whole Sunday morning for at least 2 to 3 hours, I didn't see a single person walking down the street in only one car, which was my mom coming back from the grocery store before it closed early. I remember when she got home, I went downstairs to see if she had brought any snacks or something, and I immediately knew something was wrong. She called my dad into the kitchen, and when he arrived, she told me to go upstairs to my room. I asked why, and she yelled at me, telling me to do as I was told. Dad closed the kitchen door behind me, and I walked up the stairs, but stopped on the first few steps to listen to what they were saying. I couldn't catch all the words they said, but I heard enough to know that a body had been found in the woods outside of town, and that the rumor going around was that it was a kid from my high school. I was shocked, horrified even, but I had no way of knowing which kid had been found dead. Like I said, I didn't have any friends to call about it, and this was before social media. So I couldn't just look up a hashtag or scroll through a bunch of posts to read what people were saying about it. I had to wait until school the next morning to get any real information, and then just after 8 a.m. we got an announcement from the principal saying that we all had to report to the gym for a special assembly. So we did. Me and all the other kids walked to the school gym, except it wasn't all the kids, and I think I might have been one of the first people to realize what had happened that Saturday night. While all the kids were walking into the gym, filling the seats or sitting on the floor in front of it, I noticed that a particular group wasn't there. I had gotten into the habit of keeping an eye on my old group of friends, mostly out of bitterness, to be completely honest. I wanted to know where they were as much as possible just to avoid them. So as everyone was walking through the gym doors, I was looking out to see that group. But more and more kids filled the gym, and there was no sign of my old group anywhere. Eventually, once they made sure no one else was coming, one of the teachers closed the gym doors, but still my old group of friends wasn't there. Then it hit me. Either one of them was the body pulled from the woods or they had done something truly awful. Once the doors were closed, the principal began telling us that something terrible had happened over the weekend. And the terrible thing was that a 10th grade student had been found dead in the woods just outside of town. Obviously, many of us had already heard rumors by that point, but having it confirmed by an official source was still very shocking. And I remember the gasps and oh my gods after the announcement was made. We were told that if any of us had any information, we should report it to the school resource officer. It didn't matter if classes were in session. If we had any information, we were to report it immediately. They didn't tell us who exactly had died, but we were quick to figure out who was missing from the gym since a group of 5 kids wasn't at school that day. But we didn't know which one of them was the one who had lost their life. It took some time for the truth to come out, but I had always had a feeling that something very specific had happened, and when the truth finally did come to light, it turned out I was right. The body found in the woods belonged to the new kid, the one who joined the 10th grade shortly after I did. He had been found in a shallow stretch of the river, just below the old railroad bridge, the same place where my former group of friends used to hang out on a Friday night. According to the forensics team, it seemed like the boy had jumped off the bridge thinking the river was much deeper than it actually was, but in reality it only reached his shins in the spot where he landed. He broke both of his legs and injured one of his arms in the fall, and after being unable to crawl out of the water with his one good arm, he drowned after exhausting himself. For a brief period, everyone in town thought it had been some kind of accident. You know, the kids were drinking, maybe doing drugs, and suddenly one of them thought he could fly and tried to jump off the bridge. A lot of more hysterical people in town blamed the boy's death on drugs, like that old LSD story where the college kid tries to jump off his dorm roof because he was high on acid and thought he was Superman. The same thing happened in our town, but only for a few days at most, because once we all found out what had really happened, the reaction was very different. At first, we only knew that the boy had fallen from the bridge somehow. The drug theory was prominent, and many people thought it had been some sort of accident, but a handful of others suggested that the new kid had been pushed. I feel like that was one of the more extreme or less popular theories, because people wondered why they would just murder the new kid like that. My potential new friends might have been a bunch of misfits, but they weren't evil, right? And to this day, I still don't know if it was an act of pure evil, but the police certainly decided that a law had been broken, and when the news spread that the boys had been arrested, it sent shockwaves through the local community. When they were initially being interrogated by the police, it only took a little pressure for one of them to start singing like a canary. The whole thing was supposed to be nothing more than a prank push the new kid off the bridge. The worst they thought would happen was that he'd get wet before having to walk home in wet clothes while they laughed from above. But that's not what happened, and they didn't realize what was really going on until it was too late. Apparently, the boys on the bridge climbed down, pulled him out of the water, and tried to save his life, but it wasn't enough. They couldn't revive him, and when they realized he was dead, they just ran and left him there. The next night, someone was walking their dog by the river and was the one who found the body. One boy ended up going to juvenile detention for second-degree manslaughter, and I think another boy was jailed for helping cover it up, but the other 3 boys completely got away with it. I guess the police could only charge the one who did the pushing, and the one who lied to help cover it up, but the other 3 boys were able to go back to school as if nothing had happened. They were total outcasts for the rest of high school, never shaking that stain. But there was also someone I owed an apology to, and that was the red-haired, smelly kid. Carl and I were friends for almost 20 years after that, until the day we lost him in a car accident, and I think about him every day, not just because he was a close friend I lost so suddenly, but because if it weren't for him, I might not be here to enjoy a single day without him. So here's to you, Carl, and here's to all the true friends, because God knows they're hard to find. Towards the end of 2004, the residents of Bell Close in Ipswich woke up to find a moving van parked on their street. The for sale sign in front of a vacant house had recently been removed, and overseeing the unloading of boxes and furniture was a young, very happy couple who had moved to Ipswich from the much smaller coastal town of Felixstowe. To their neighbors, they represented happiness, harmony, and hope for the future. However, what no one knew, except one, was that the arrival of the couple foreshadowed a great and terrible darkness. On the night of December 2nd, 2006, just over 2 years after the young couple had moved to Belle Close, a local police officer was patrolling the banks of a nearby river when he made a terrifying discovery. The naked body of a young woman was floating in the waters of Belstead Brook. Within an hour, the scene was filled with uniformed officers, plainclothes detectives, and forensic teams in white coats. The woman turned out to be Gemma Rose Adams, 25 years old, who had last been seen about 3 weeks earlier near West End Road in Ipswich. The police discovered that Gemma had been addicted to heroin during her teenage years and had been working as a prostitute at the time of her murder. Only 6 days later, on December 8th, the body of Tanya Nickel, 19 years old, was found floating in a nearby body of water. Tanya had managed to graduate from high school, but by the age of 17 she was living in emergency housing while prostituting herself to support a growing drug addiction. The police interviewed those who knew her and found that she had been a close friend of the first victim, Gemma Adams. The detectives had not yet begun a proper investigation into Tanya's death when a third body was found in a wooded area near Nacton. Annalie Alderton, 24 years old, was 3 months pregnant when she was strangled before her body was placed in a cruciform position. She was last seen on the 6:43 p.m. train to Ipswich, but after disembarking at the station she disappeared. The police found that Annalie had attended Seston High School, where her academic performance had been exemplary. However, after her father's death from lung cancer in 1998, Annalie had become increasingly dependent on heroin to cope with her grief. Following the discovery of 3 bodies in quick succession, the Suffolk police held a press conference in front of a group of local journalists. After the results of a preliminary investigation, the police chief warned all women in Suffolk to stay away from poorly lit areas in Ipswich after dark. The day after the press conference, the bodies of 2 more young women were found near Levington. According to the police, Paula Cannell, 24 years old, and Annette Nichols, 20 years old, had been killed by compression of the throat. Paula Cannell was last seen on the night of December 10th, and just a few days earlier, she had participated in a man-on-the-street-style interview with the local news about the recent murders. Cannell, a self-declared prostitute, told the reporter that she was a little worried about getting into cars, but I need the money. The police discovered that she had moved to Ipswich about 10 years ago and had her 3 children taken away due to a devastating heroin addiction. Annette Nichols, the oldest of the 5 victims, had been addicted to drugs for about 6 years. A mother of 1, she had worked as a beautician before her addiction but had given up custody of her child to engage in organized prostitution. She was also the only other victim who had been placed in a cruciform position like the image of Christ on the cross. Given the victims' backgrounds, the locations where they were left, and the ways in which Nichols and Alderton had been positioned, the Suffolk police concluded that the murders were linked. They launched a large-scale investigation called Operation Sumac, with the police chief declaring that public assistance would be key to its success. The killer, they believed, was a burly man between 30 and 40 years old, who almost certainly lived among them. He was someone's husband, someone's father, or someone's son. The police would do everything they could to bring the man to justice, but they weren't in the best position to spot the signs. They warned Ipswich citizens to be alert to anyone who had recently cleaned their car meticulously, or to anyone who disappeared at night for long periods without explanation. The prospect cast a dark cloud over Ipswich and its citizens, leaving them wondering who would be next. On December 14th, the police held another press conference where they announced that the investigation was progressing steadily. They had discovered that each woman had been killed at a primary location, before being transported to a body of water or a wooded area near a school or church. They also announced that they believed their suspect was a violent man, possibly religious, who frequented women of the night. They subsequently warned the public to be on the lookout for any man who had suddenly acquired women's clothing, as it was believed that the killer often took trophies from his unfortunate victims. The next day, the police announced that the number of officers working on the case full-time had increased to 600, and that staff from more than 25 British police forces were providing material or human resources to the investigation. Only 5 days later, on December 19, 2006, Suffolk police carried out a raid early in the morning on a quiet suburban street south of the River Orwell. The name of the street was Bell Close, and the man arrested was a 48-year-old man named Steve Wright, the same man who had moved into the vacant house with his partner more than 2 years earlier. The move had been an optimistic one, with Steve and his wife enjoying the opportunity to start a new life together after Steve's failed first marriage. However, somehow, it ended with the brutal murders of 5 young women, leaving both loved ones and law enforcement wondering why. Steve Wright was born in Norfolk in April 1958 and was the second child of an RAF policeman and a veterinary nurse. Due to his father's career, the family moved frequently during Steve's childhood, and he spent his youth in Malta, Singapore, and Suffolk. Before Steve was 10 years old, his parents went through a bitterly hard divorce. His father later said that Steve's mother abandoned them, leaving the young boy searching for a maternal figure he would never find. On the other hand, Steve's mother claimed that his father was a violent drunk and that she left out of fear for her life. She also claimed that fear for Steve was the only reason she hadn't taken him with her, as his father had sworn to find and kill them if she tried to take their son. As a result of his turbulent upbringing, Steve grew up as a painfully shy young man who struggled with relationships and employment. He dropped out of school at 16 with no qualifications, and after a brief stint as a hotel waiter, he joined the British Merchant Navy. He worked as a chef on ocean liners departing from Felixstowe, but after less than a year of service, he requested separation. Steve then drifted from one job to another, working as a stevedore, bartender, landlord, and forklift driver. But it didn't take long for him to return to sailing, and he applied for a position as a steward on the Queen Elizabeth II cruise ship. Steve spent 6 years aboard the QE2 and traveled the world in the process. At every port where they stopped, Steve was given a few days of shore leave, but unlike his shipmates who spent their time shopping or sightseeing, Steve would usually visit local brothels. It became something of an addiction for him, and his shipmates knew that he would disappear for days before returning to the ship, appearing quiet and distant. At the end of his 6 years on the QE2, Steve moved to Norwich and became the landlord of a pub known as the Ferry Boat Inn. The pub was located in an extremely rough area of Norwich and was frequented by many of the city's women of the night. It was believed that Steve was a regular client of theirs, and this may or may not have contributed to his eventual dismissal just 5 months after being hired. Steve then moved to London, where he was visited by his mother during the holidays of 1992. Patricia Wright later told reporters that despite a warm initial reception, her son completely changed on Christmas Day. Steve drank continuously from morning to night, and when his mother suggested that he slow down a bit, he exploded in anger and threw her out of his house. It was this and that, she told reporters. He said awful things. Obviously, he didn't want anything to do with me. It was around this time that Steve began visiting massage parlors in London, but this was an expensive habit that didn't suit the minimum wage jobs he tended to have. As a result, Steve began gambling to fund his nocturnal company, but it wasn't long before mounting debts started to take a toll. Seeing no other way out of his current situation, Steve attempted suicide by gas in his car and was later found lying in an alley in Hill before being taken to the hospital. Steve's stepbrother, Keith, learned that his brother had racked up £30,000 in debt in just a few months and added that the incident proved to be a turning point in Steve's life. He used to be quite outgoing, Keith said. He'd go out for a beer, have a laugh and a joke, but after that, he became a bit quiet. It was hard to get anything out of him. After his recovery, Steve embarked on a 10-week trip to Thailand, spending all the money he had left on pills and prostitutes. He even sold his car and furniture to finance the trip, and upon his return, Steve was forced to move in with his elderly father to avoid sleeping on the streets. Having hit rock bottom, Steve seemed to undergo a period of intense self-improvement while living with his father. He found a series of stable jobs that allowed him to become a member of a local golf club, and he was a regular visitor to the bar of a luxury hotel. Steve was doing so well that he managed to start a relationship with a woman named Pamela, the same woman he would eventually move in with at Bell Close in Ipswich in 2004. The meeting marked a period of relative stability in Steve's life, and before his move to Ipswich, he had completely stopped visiting brothels. However, only 6 months after moving to Bell Close, old habits returned with a vengeance. Steve began by visiting massage parlors, but in October 2006, he discovered that he could buy company for as little as £20 from the street prostitutes who roamed near his home. One woman claimed that Steve had visited her 3 days after the discovery of the last 2 victims. He was a regular client, I felt safe with him, she said. But that night he turned violent. He pinned me down, which he hadn't done before. It scared me because it wasn't like him. But when I heard he had changed, I thought, oh God, I've been in his house. He could have done anything to me. I never thought it was him. Steve's trial began on January 16, 2008, with his defense based on the idea that although he was a regular visitor to Ipswich's so-called red light district, he was not the killer of the women. The prosecution raised the possibility that Steve had an accomplice, arguing that there was no evidence that the victims' bodies had been dragged by a single person. Just 1 month later, on February 21st, after 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned unanimous verdicts against Wright on all 5 counts of murder, prompting the prosecution to argue that Wright should receive a full life tariff and therefore never be released from prison. The judge granted their request, and the next day Steve Wright was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison at Her Majesty's pleasure. Greg Bradshaw, the brother-in-law of Paula Kennel, told the press that these crimes deserved the maximum punishment, which could only mean one thing, either the death penalty or life imprisonment. He will be guarded by the establishment at great cost to the taxpayers of this country and emotionally to the grieving families, Bradshaw said. However, the father of Gemma Adams was not as quick to call for violence when he said, I am very relieved and pleased for all the families that this is over. Finally, we can all begin to move on with our lives in peace. I never imagined that a job offer could change my life so much. I received a proposal to work in a small town in Germany, one that didn't even appear on the most detailed maps. The offer was for a position that fit perfectly with my professional profile, and although it was far from my hometown, the promise of a higher salary and the possibility of advancing my career pushed me to accept. The decision to move wasn't easy, but my financial situation left little room for the luxury of choice. My new home was a small stone and wood house located on the edge of the town. From the moment I set foot in the small front garden, I knew it was different. The tranquility was almost overwhelming, and the silence that enveloped the place had a strange quality, as if everything was contained under a layer of unsettling calm. The house, although old and somewhat worn, had a particular charm that made me feel welcomed. The first few weeks passed in a kind of accelerated routine, adapting to the new life and exploring the town, which was much smaller than I had imagined. The people in the town were, in general, friendly and polite, but there was something about the way they avoided asking personal questions that made me feel uncomfortable. There was an invisible barrier, a line that shouldn't be crossed. The neighbors were courteous, but kept their distance, as if my presence was a curiosity they had to tolerate rather than accept. They welcomed me with smiles and superficial comments, but there was a lack of warmth that made me question the true nature of the place. My life unfolded with an almost monotonous calm until one autumn night, when something changed forever. It was a particularly cold night, and the wind blew with an intensity that made the windows creak. I was in my kitchen, preparing a quick dinner, when the screams began. At first I thought they were just sounds of the night, some animal or perhaps children playing in the distance, but as the sound intensified, I realized it was not something common. They were screams of despair mixed with harsh voices and cruel laughter. My heart began to race. I gathered my courage and peeked out the kitchen window, trying to see where those disturbing sounds were coming from. What I saw froze my blood. The lights of police patrols illuminated the darkness of the night, casting long shadows that danced sinisterly on the walls of neighboring houses. The town, which during the day seemed so peaceful, had transformed into a scene of chaos and violence. The house being surrounded belonged to a woman who had arrived in town shortly before I did. I barely knew her. Our interactions had been limited to polite greetings and brief exchanges about the weather. But there was something about her gaze that had always unsettled me. She was a lonely woman with an air of sadness and an expression that sometimes seemed lost in her own thoughts. That night, the air around her seemed charged with a tension you could cut with a knife. The pounding on her door was loud and aggressive. I could hear the metallic sound of tools against the wood and the creaking of the door giving way under the pressure. The woman's screams mingled with the sounds of violence. In a desperate impulse, I moved closer to the window, trying to see through the slats of the blinds. Through the fogged glass, I saw the officers entering the house, dragging the woman with a brutality that defied any sense of justice. My mind was in a state of absolute confusion. I couldn't understand what was happening or why the police, who were supposed to be the guardians of the law, were carrying out such a ruthless act. The woman's screams grew weaker and weaker, replaced by the dull sound of blows and the officers' voices laughing in cruel and derisive tones. I felt trapped between helplessness and terror, unable to intervene and terrified by the possibility that I could be the next target. The scene dragged on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, when the screams ceased completely, the silence that followed was overwhelming. The officers left the house, their faces impassive and their steps determined, as if what they had just done was nothing more than a routine task. The woman who had been such a fleeting presence in my life had disappeared from the face of the earth. There was no sign of her, neither in the news nor in the town's conversations. The next day, the town seemed to have returned to normal, as if the violence of the previous night had never happened. The local news didn't mention anything about the woman's disappearance. No one in the town seemed willing to talk about what had happened. The neighbors behaved with a strange indifference, and any attempt to ask about the incident was met with evasions and nervous glances. The calm after the storm was even more unsettling than the chaos itself. My life in the town continued, but the memory of that night became a constant shadow in my mind. Every time I saw a police officer, I felt a pang of terror and distrust. The knowledge of what had occurred and the sense that no one else knew the truth filled me with a feeling of isolation and despair. The fear that the truth might come to light, and the helplessness of being unable to do anything to change it, kept me awake at night. Over time, the weight of the secret became too heavy to bear. The tension and fear began to affect my health and emotional well-being. The feeling that I lived in a place where justice had no meaning, and where authority was corrupted, was overwhelming. I felt that my only option was to leave the town and return to an environment where I could feel safe. Finally, I made the decision to move back in with my parents. The idea of returning to a place that was familiar and where I could find some peace of mind was the only thing that gave me comfort. However, the trauma of that night never left me. The image of the woman being tortured and the knowledge that the culprits were the same people responsible for protecting the community became an emotional burden I would carry with me forever. Today, as I try to rebuild my life in a safer place, the memory of that night remains a persistent ghost. The truth of what happened in that small German town is a secret that haunts me, and the feeling of helplessness in knowing that the real terror can come from those who are supposed to keep us safe is a wound that will never heal. The law, which should have been a symbol of justice and protection, became a dark reminder that true fear sometimes comes from those with the power to harm without consequence. Returning to my parents' house was a temporary relief, but the weight of the secret I carried with me didn't fade. I tried to adapt to the life I had left behind, but the trauma of that night in the German town had left deep scars. The safety of my family home couldn't erase the terror I had experienced or the disturbing images that continued to haunt my thoughts. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of my life in my hometown began to reappear. However, the silence I had experienced in the town and the feeling of distrust toward figures of authority remained a constant shadow. Casual encounters with police on the street or at community events made me feel uncomfortable and alert. The normality of my old life now seemed a cruel contrast to the horror I had witnessed. Months passed before I could talk about what had happened. The need to share my experience with someone, to express the pain and helplessness I felt, became almost overwhelming. I had tried in vain to find some form of justice or answers, but the barriers I encountered were impenetrable. The lack of information in the news and the evasive attitude of the neighbors in the town were clear signs that the secret had been buried under a blanket of collective silence. One night, after months of internal struggle, I decided to confide everything to a close friend. The conversation was difficult and loaded with emotions. My words flowed in a torrent of anguish as I described the events with all the detail I could remember. My friend's response, though supportive, couldn't ease the burden I carried. The disbelief and shock on his face only served to remind me how implausible my experience seemed. Despite his support, I knew the truth was beyond what he could understand or accept. Time passed and life went on, but the experience left an indelible mark on my mind and memory. The sense of insecurity and distrust that had been born in the German town extended to other aspects of my life. The authority figures I once considered protectors now seemed inherently suspicious. The idea that the system could be corrupt, or that justice could be an empty concept, became a constant part of my reality. As the years went by, I tried to rebuild my life in the hope of leaving the past behind. However, the memory of that night remained a persistent presence. The feeling of helplessness and frustration over not having been able to do anything to prevent the woman's tragedy led me to explore different ways of making sense of my experience. I began to get involved in awareness activities about corruption and abuse of power, trying to use my experience as a platform to fight for justice, albeit in an indirect way. With time, the story of the town and the woman became a painful but manageable memory. I did my best to move on, but the trauma never completely disappeared. The impact of that night in the German town taught me a bitter lesson about the nature of power and the fragility of justice. The image of the tortured woman, and the knowledge that those responsible were above any reproach, remained a heavy burden.